The hum of the factory machines still rang in John Whitaker's ears when he walked into the corner store that Friday evening. His hand smelled faintly of oil and steel, the same smell that had followed him home for over 20 years. He wasn't the kind of man who believed in miracles. Life had trained him to expect broken promises, overdue bills, and long shifts that left him bone-tired. But on that night, for no reason he could explain, he bought a lottery ticket. A small gamble. A silly thought that maybe luck could finally land on him. 3 days later, luck did. When John stood in front of the television, ticket in hand, his fingers trembled so badly he nearly tore the paper. The announcer's voice was nothing more than background noise until the numbers started to align. 1, 2, 3, 4 as numbers. By the time the final number flashed on the screen, John collapsed onto the couch, heart racing, eyes wide in disbelief. He had won $245,000. It wasn't the kind of jackpot that made headlines, but to John, it was salvation. It meant the mortgage could be caught up, the car finally fixed, and maybe, just maybe, he could breathe without the weight of debt crushing his chest. He imagined a future where he and his wife, Marissa, didn't argue about late bills or skip dinners. A future where life felt lighter. "Marissa," he shouted, voice hoarse with excitement. "Come here. You won't believe this." She appeared in the doorway, still wearing her work blouse, her dark hair pulled back too tightly. Her eyes flickered with curiosity, then widened when John thrust the ticket toward her like a golden key. "We won," he whispered, almost reverently. $245,000. For a moment, she mirrored his joy. Her lips parted in surprise, and she laughed, really laughed, in a way John hadn't heard in years. She threw her arms around him, and he felt her body tremble with adrenaline. But as quickly as the warmth came, it cooled. Her smile lingered, but her eyes shifted, calculating, as though already running numbers in her head. John didn't notice. He was too wrapped in his dream. "We'll pay off the house, Marissa," he said eagerly. "And the medical bills, God, we can clear all of it. Maybe even take a small trip. Just us. Somewhere quiet. Doesn't that sound good?" She nodded, her hand resting gently on his arm. "It sounds perfect, John." But her tone carried a strange weight, as though the words were rehearsed. Behind her eyes, another thought flickered, one John would never see. To her, the money wasn't just a lifeline. It was freedom. That night, while John sat at the kitchen table scribbling ideas on a notepad, lists of debts to erase, things to repair, people to call, Marissa lingered in the doorway. The glow of the overhead light sharpened the lines of her face. She studied him the way one studies a locked safe, not with affection, but with hunger. She forced a smile when he looked up. "You should get some sleep," she murmured. "Big day tomorrow." John laughed, rubbing his eyes. "Yeah, a new beginning, right?" "Right," she said softly, though the word tasted different in her mouth. Upstairs, long after John's steady snores filled the room, Marissa lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The numbers replayed in her head, not as salvation, but as possession. $250,000 could rewrite her life. It could erase years of resentment, suffocating nights, and unfulfilled promises. And if John wasn't careful, it could erase him too. She turned onto her side, eyes cold in the dark. The smile she wore earlier had vanished, replaced with a thin line of determination. By morning, the cracks in their marriage, the ones John believed money would fix, were already beginning to widen. By morning, John was already awake, scribbling numbers on the back of an old envelope. His handwriting was rushed, uneven, as though the sheer excitement of organizing their new life couldn't be slowed by something as trivial as neatness. Mortgage balance, car repairs, credit cards. He circled each figure with satisfaction, the way a soldier might cross enemies off a list. Marissa poured herself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, watching him with narrowed eyes. He looked lighter than she had seen him in years, almost boyish in his optimism. "You've been at that all night?" she asked. John grinned, rubbing his temple. "Couldn't sleep. Kept thinking about everything we can do. We'll be free, Marissa. No more late notices, no more stress." He slid the paper across the table like a treasure map. "Look, if we pay everything off, we'll still have about 50,000 left. That's enough to fix up the house. Maybe even get you that new car you've wanted. And maybe a small vacation, Florida, maybe? I know you've always wanted to see the ocean again. Marissa forced a smile, though her chest tightened with something sharp. A new car. Florida. Debt payments. He spoke as if $245,000 was barely more than a patch kit for their worn-out lives. To him, the money meant survival. To her, it meant escape. She stirred her coffee slowly, hiding her thoughts. That all sounds practical, she said carefully. John looked at her, confused. Practical is good. It's what we need. But in Marissa's mind, practical was another word for small. She imagined fine clothes, sleek apartments in the city, dinners at restaurants where no one knew her past. For years, she had felt trapped in the narrow routines of their marriage, in the stale air of a home filled with broken promises. Now, for the first time, she saw a door opening, and John was already shutting it with his lists and ledgers. That evening, they sat at the kitchen table again, John still riding the high of possibility. He talked about calling the bank, about negotiating bills, about maybe setting up a small savings account for the future. His excitement poured out in endless details, but with every word, Marissa felt the gulf between them widen. Finally, she interrupted. Is that really all you want, John? To just pay bills? He looked at her, startled. What do you mean? Isn't that what we've been fighting for? A little peace? A little stability? Her eyes hardened. Stability doesn't change anything. It just keeps us where we are. We could use this money to start over somewhere else. New city, new life. Don't you ever want more than this? John frowned, shaking his head. Marissa, this is more than enough. We're not 20 anymore. We don't need big risks. We just need to live without fear. The words stung her, though she said nothing. Instead, she sipped her wine and let silence settle between them. But in that silence, her resentment grew. She wanted a life unshackled, not patched up scraps of the one she already despised. Over the next few days, John carried his ticket stub like a lucky charm, already imagining the future he believed would heal them. But Marissa's smiles were thinner now, her touches more mechanical. She began to withdraw in subtle ways. Late nights at work, phone calls made in hushed tones, eyes that lingered too long on the world outside their small home. To John, it looked like stress. To Marissa, it was strategy. One night, as he fell asleep beside her, whispering about how grateful he was, she lay awake once more. His dreams were chains, hers were wings. The money had not bound them together. It had drawn the first clear line between them. And soon, she would begin to imagine what her life might look like without him standing in the way. The following Saturday, John met his old friend Mark at a small diner on the edge of town. They'd known each other since high school, the kind of friendship that had weathered years of distance and silence, yet never quite broke. John had wanted to keep the lottery win quiet, but the weight of it pressed on him until he felt he might burst. If there was anyone he could trust, it was Mark. Over coffee, John leaned forward, lowering his voice. I haven't told many people yet, he said, eyes darting around the room. But I want some money. A lot, actually. Mark chuckled, thinking it a joke. What, a couple hundred on scratch-offs? John shook his head, pulling the ticket stub carefully from his wallet, like a sacred object. 245,000. Can you believe it? For a long moment, Mark just stared, his mouth parting in disbelief. Then he let out a low whistle. Jesus, John. That's life-changing. John smiled, though his tone was modest. Well, maybe not life-changing, but it's enough to breathe again. I want to pay off the debts, fix up the house, maybe finally take Marissa somewhere nice. She deserves it. Mark studied him, a hint of concern in his expression. And what about you? What do you want out of it? John paused, caught off guard by the question. Me? I just want things to be steady. Normal. That's enough for me. Neither of them noticed a figure, standing just outside the diner's entrance. Marissa hadn't planned to follow John, but unease had gnawed at her since the win. He seemed too content, too quick to wrap their future neatly in envelopes of debt payments and modest plans. She needed to know what he wasn't telling her. When she saw him leaning close to Mark, speaking in hushed tones, her stomach twisted. Through the glass, she caught fragments of their conversation. Words like debts, house, and trip. John was smiling, gesturing with his hands, and Marissa's chest tightened. He was confiding in Mark before her. Worse, he was already dividing the money in ways that left no room for the future she envisioned. By the time John returned home that afternoon, Marissa had composed herself. She greeted him with a kiss, asked casually about his day, but her mind churned beneath the surface. If he was willing to share his dreams with Mark, what else might he share? Was the money already slipping through her fingers before she had even touched it? That night, as John spoke glowingly about how Mark thinks this could be the fresh start we need, Marissa sat silently, nodding, while bile rose in her throat. She thought about Mark, steady, trustworthy Mark, and wondered how much influence he really held over her husband. When John fell asleep, she lingered by the window, staring out into the darkened street. A dangerous thought crept into her mind, uninvited yet impossible to dismiss. What if John didn't plan to share all of it with her? What if, in his endless devotion to safety and modesty, he locked away the fortune and left her trapped exactly where she'd been all these years? She clenched her fists at her sides, heart pounding. For the first time, the money no longer felt like theirs. It felt like his, and that was unacceptable. From that moment, a quiet, venomous seed began to take root inside her. And with each passing day, as John dreamed of security, Marissa would dream of something else entirely, a life where she alone held the key to freedom. Marissa's growing resentment became harder to conceal with each passing day. John was blind in his optimism, scribbling figures on scraps of paper, humming softly as if money alone could glue their fractured marriage back together. But while he clung to his modest dreams, Marissa carried secrets of her own, ones that had nothing to do with debt or vacations. On Tuesday evenings, she told John she was working late at the office. In reality, she drove across town to a small apartment above a pawn shop where Kyle waited. Kyle was everything John wasn't: young, reckless, alive with a kind of hunger that thrilled her. He was in his late 20s, lean and restless, with tattoos creeping up his arms like ivy. When Marissa entered, he pulled her close before she could even close the door. His kisses were urgent, his hands insistent, and for a few hours she shed the role of dutiful wife and lived as though she were free. But freedom came with a price. Afterward, as they lay tangled in sweat-stained sheets, Kyle lit a cigarette and exhaled toward the cracked ceiling. "You keep saying you'll leave him," he muttered, "but you're still there, still pretending." Marissa stared at him, her jaw tight. "You don't understand. It's complicated." "Complicated?" He scoffed. "You don't love him. You love this." He gestured between them, his eyes sharp. "So what are you waiting for?" Her throat went dry. Divorce was an option, not now. Not when $250,000 was sitting in John's name. If she left, she'd walk away with nothing. The thought made her chest ache with frustration. "I can't just leave," she whispered. "Not yet." Kyle turned toward her, studying her expression. "Then when? You think he's going to hand you the money out of the goodness of his heart? You really believe that?" Marissa's silence was answer enough. He leaned closer, lowering his voice to a dangerous whisper. "Maybe the problem isn't money. Maybe the problem is him." She stiffened, though his words ignited something deep within her. For weeks, she had buried the thought, ashamed of its shape, terrified of its weight. But hearing it spoken aloud made it real. Kyle's hand brushed hers, his tone coaxing. "If he wasn't in the picture, you'd have everything. The money. Me. A fresh start." Marissa pulled away, shaking her head as though to banish the idea. "Don't say that." "Why not?" Kyle pressed. "You've already thought it. I can see it in your eyes." She wanted to deny it, to protest, but the words wouldn't come. He was right. She had thought it. In the quiet of their bedroom, while John slept, she had imagined what life might look like without him. She had pictured herself free, money in hand, future wide open. And each time, the fantasy had felt less like a nightmare and more like a plan. Kyle stubbed out his cigarette, his voice low and insistent. You know he'll never give you the life you want. You know that. Marissa closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. She told herself she was only trapped because of the money, that if John had never won, she might have been content to stay, to endure. But now she had seen what was possible, and she couldn't unsee it. When she returned home that night, John was waiting at the kitchen table, his face lighting up as she walked in. He pushed a plate toward her, reheated leftovers from the night before. "Thought you might be hungry," he said warmly. She forced a smile, sitting down across from him. He began talking about bank appointments, about careful planning, about their future. His voice was steady, hopeful, filled with love he still believed was mutual. But as Marissa watched him, she no longer saw a husband. She saw an obstacle. And for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a world where John Whitaker never lived long enough to spend a single cent of that fortune. Marissa's forbidden desires had found their voice in Kyle, but turning fantasy into reality required patience. She couldn't simply confront John or risk an impulsive move. Instead, she chose a slower, more calculated path, one that required John to lose faith in everyone but her. It began subtly. One evening, as John mentioned meeting Mark for lunch again, Marissa tilted her head, her expression laced with doubt. "Mark seems a little interested in your money, don't you think?" John frowned, taken aback. "What? No, Mark's not like that." She offered a soft smile, reaching for his hand. I know. But people change, John. Money changes them. Didn't you notice how eager he was to hear all the details? Just be careful." The suggestion was light, harmless on the surface. Yet it planted a seed. Days later, when Mark stopped by unannounced, Marissa welcomed him warmly, but her eyes lingered on John with a quiet, knowing look. When Mark left, she sighed. "Funny how he always shows up right when you're alone, isn't it? Almost like he's keeping tabs." John shook his head, but uncertainty flickered in his eyes. He had always trusted Mark, yet Marissa's words clung to him like burrs. Soon it wasn't just Mark. At the grocery store, Marissa whispered about neighbors watching too closely, about co-workers suddenly remembering John's name when they never cared before. "People can sense it," she murmured. "They know you've got something now. Everyone wants a piece." At first, John laughed it off. But then he began noticing glances that lingered too long, questions that felt too probing. He started clutching his wallet a little tighter, double-checking locked doors before bed. Marissa never pushed too hard. She let him connect the dots himself, feeding his growing paranoia with carefully chosen words. When he voiced doubt, she tilted her head sympathetically and said, "Maybe I'm overthinking. Maybe it's just me." Her self-doubt was a mask, one that made her seem innocent, while her poison seeped deeper. The more John clung to her, the more she withdrew. Nights grew quieter. Her laughter, once genuine, now sounded brittle. She touched him less, smiled less, and when he asked what was wrong, she offered vague answers. "I'm just tired." Or worse, "Sometimes I wonder if you really see me at all." He tried harder, of course. Brought her flowers from the corner store, cooked dinner on nights she came home late. But his efforts only seemed to widen the gap. Every time he reached out, she let her silence punish him. By the third week, John felt the weight pressing on his chest. What should have been the happiest time of his life was quickly becoming the most suffocating. He lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, replaying conversations in his head. Was Mark really acting strangely? Were neighbors really watching? Was Marissa pulling away because of something he'd done? Doubt gnawed at him, leaving him restless and insecure. And Marissa watched, satisfied. The stronger his confusion grew, the weaker his defenses became. She had tilted his world just enough to make him lean on her, even as she slowly withdrew. One night, John whispered, almost childlike, "Do you think I'm doing the right thing with the money?" Marissa brushed his cheek with her fingers, her eyes unreadable. "I think you need to trust me more, John. I'm the only one who truly has your best interests at heart." The words settled in him, like scripture. He believed her, because he wanted to. But as John drifted into uneasy sleep, Marissa sat awake, her eyes cold in the dim glow of the bedside lamp. The manipulation was working. He was questioning himself, doubting his closest friend, leaning only on her, exactly where she needed him to be. And soon, she thought grimly, it would be time to turn whispers and doubts into something far more permanent. The storm rolled in slowly, carrying with it the kind of thick, damp air that seemed to settle on the skin like a warning. The sky split open with jagged veins of lightning, each flash briefly illuminating the quiet house. Rain lashed against the windows, relentless, as if nature itself wanted to be part of the night's dark intent. Inside, John sat in his armchair, the flickering glow of the television casting shadows across his tired face. He rubbed his temples, exhaustion etched deep into the lines that worry had carved over the past weeks. Marissa moved about the kitchen quietly, her every movement deliberate, almost ritualistic. She opened a drawer, her hands trembling as she reached for the amber pill bottle hidden beneath tea towels. Her breath came shallow as she tipped the bottle over her palm, watching the white tablets tumble out. They looked harmless, almost innocent, but she knew their strength. Crushing them with the back of a spoon, she pressed down until the pills became fine powder, her hands slick with sweat despite the cool air. She whispered to herself, a desperate chant under her breath. It has to look like an accident. No one can know. John called out from the living room, his voice tired but warm. Marissa, is the coffee ready? Her throat tightened. Coffee. It would mask the bitterness. She stirred the powder into his cup, careful to mix it fully, forcing her hands to stay steady. The spoon clinked against the ceramic, echoing louder than she expected. For a moment, she froze, afraid he'd notice her hesitation. But John only coughed and turned his attention back to the screen. She carried the mug to him, her smile painted on, though her lips quivered as she set it on the table beside him. Here you go, darling, she said softly. John gave her a weary smile, lifting the mug with grateful hands. You always know what I need. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest as he took his first sip. She lowered herself onto the couch, watching him drink, every swallow like a countdown in her mind. Lightning flashed again, illuminating his face. He looked older in that moment, fragile even, and for the briefest second she hesitated, wondering if she could still stop this. But Kyle's voice returned to her memory, sharp and insistent. He won't let you go. Not with the money. If you want us, if you want freedom, there's only one way. John set the mug down after finishing half, sighing as he leaned back into the chair. His eyelids fluttered, heavier than usual. He rubbed at his chest as though something inside him had gone suddenly wrong. Marissa, he murmured, confusion edging his tone. What's happening? Her hands clenched in her lap, nails biting into her skin. You're just tired, John. Maybe the storm. It always gets to you, she whispered, though her voice shook. But John's body betrayed him. His breaths grew shallow, ragged, and his fingers trembled as he tried to grip the armrest. He looked at her then, his eyes wide, fear dawning in them. His lips parted as if to call for help, but the only name that came out was hers. Marissa, he gasped, disbelief lacing the single word. She stood frozen, every muscle taut, as she watched the man she once loved, the man she had vowed to share her life with, slump forward. The coffee mug slid from the table, shattering on the floor. His body convulsed once, then twice, before collapsing against the chair. The storm raged outside, a furious witness to the betrayal unfolding within. Marissa clamped a hand over her mouth, her breath coming in frantic bursts. She hadn't expected it to happen so fast, hadn't prepared for the sound of his strangled gasps or the sight of his eyes clouding over. She whispered his name, but it was too late. His last breath rattled into silence. Lightning cracked across the sky again, and with it, a realization struck her. There was no turning back now. And somewhere deep inside, as she stared at John's lifeless form, a new fear began to rise, one she hadn't planned for. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the steady drum of rain against the windows. John's body lay motionless on the floor, his face pale, his last breath still echoing faintly in Marissa's ears. For a moment, she stood frozen, staring at him, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her chest. Then, as though a switch flipped inside her, she moved quickly. There was no time to hesitate. Not if she wanted to keep her story intact. She knelt beside him, feigning a trembling hand as she touched his cheek. "Oh God, John," she whispered, forcing her voice to quiver. "Please, no." She repeated the words like a mantra, rehearsing grief before the audience had even arrived. The pills had done their job, but she needed the scene to speak for itself. A tragic accident. A man too tired, too distracted, too unlucky. The wine glass on the table remained untouched. She cursed herself, silently, for forgetting to wet his lips with it. Hastily, she tilted the glass and poured some of the wine across the floor near his body, letting it pool unevenly. It looked sloppy, but maybe sloppy would sell the lie. She then dragged the bottle halfway beneath the counter, as if it had slipped from his hand. Her fingers shook as she positioned it, and she wiped the neck with a dishcloth, careful to erase her own prints. Her reflection caught in the window as lightning illuminated the room. The woman staring back at her didn't look guilty. She looked terrified. But Marissa knew that terror could be her greatest weapon. Who would question a grieving widow? Her face streaked with tears, her sobs echoing against the sterile walls of her expensive kitchen. She dialed 911, forcing herself to scream into the receiver. "It's my husband. Please, please. He's not breathing. He fell. He hit his head. There's so much blood. Oh my God, please hurry." She had practiced the cadence of hysteria for weeks in her head, but now the panic sounded real, perhaps because a part of her actually was afraid, not of John's death, but of discovery. When the paramedics arrived, Marissa played her role flawlessly. She clutched John's limp hand, her shoulders convulsing with sobs as she begged them to save him. The officers who followed wore the same practiced expressions she had seen in countless television dramas, professional, sympathetic, but observant. They asked questions in low tones, jotting notes, watching her as much as they examined the scene. "He'd been drinking," Marissa explained, choking back tears. "He wasn't himself lately. Stressed. Distracted. He must have lost his balance." Her story spilled out smoothly, the details rehearsed. But then came the small details she hadn't accounted for. One officer noticed the wine glass, barely touched, and glanced at her before scribbling something down. Another asked why the bottle seemed half hidden under the counter instead of smashed nearby. Marissa stammered through her answer, her throat dry, her body trembling just enough to pass as grief but edging toward nervousness. I don't know. I just found him like this. I didn't touch anything." They didn't challenge her, not yet, but their silence was unnerving. She could feel suspicion creeping into the room like smoke, invisible but suffocating. When they finally carried John's body away, the house felt cavernous, hollow in its sudden stillness. Marissa stood alone in the kitchen, her tear-stained face pressed against the cool glass of the window. The rain had eased, but thunder still rumbled in the distance, as if nature itself wasn't finished with her. She told herself she had won, that the money, the freedom, the life she wanted was now within reach. Yet as the red and blue lights faded down the street, Marissa couldn't shake the feeling that the silence left behind wasn't safety at all. It was a trap waiting to spring. And in that silence, the questions began to grow louder. The storm outside had cleared, but a different kind of storm was beginning to brew within the walls of the small town. John's death, officially marked as a tragic accident, had already begun to stir unease. What should have been a closed chapter was anything but. Detective Miguel Alvarez was assigned to the case. Though it was listed as an accidental fall, the file landed on his desk because of a lingering note of uncertainty. Alvarez had worked enough cases to know that grief had a rhythm, a raw unpredictability. But when he sat across from Marissa during his first interview, her grief felt rehearsed. Her tears came on cue, breaking in the exact moments when silence hung too long. Her voice cracked at the right words, but her eyes held a steadiness that unsettled him. "Tell me again," Alvarez asked gently. "What happened that night?" Marissa sniffled, dabbing her eyes with a perfectly folded tissue. "We had some wine. Johnny'd been so tired lately. He got up suddenly, and I think he slipped. The floor was wet from the rain. I tried to help, but he was gone before I could do anything." Her delivery was flawless, but Alvarez's pen paused over the word wine. According to the coroner's initial report, John's blood alcohol level was unusually low for someone who had supposedly shared a night of drinking. Yet, on the table, a nearly full glass of red wine had been found untouched. A bottle had been discovered by the sink, its position odd, almost as though placed there in haste. It was nothing concrete, just shadows at the edge of a larger picture. But Alvarez trusted those shadows. They had guided him to the truth in cases others had dismissed. Meanwhile, Mark was restless. He had been John's closest friend for years, and nothing about the official explanation sat right with him. John had been cautious, especially after turning 40. He never rushed across slippery floors, never drank heavily, and certainly never lost his footing so badly as to kill himself. Mark couldn't stop hearing John's last voicemail, left only a day before his death, where he had sounded troubled but hopeful. "Things will get better soon," John had said cryptically. Those weren't the words of a man teetering on the edge. Mark went to the station, insisting on meeting with Alvarez. Their first conversation was charged with emotion. "Detective, you don't know him like I do," Mark pressed. "John didn't just slip. Something else happened that night, and if you don't look into her, into Marissa, you'll be missing the truth." Alvarez studied Mark carefully. He wasn't ready to reveal his own doubts yet, but he noted the raw conviction in the man's tone. Friends sometimes saw red flags others ignored. Mark's certainty added weight to the inconsistencies Alvarez had already noticed. That evening, Alvarez returned to the crime scene with a small flashlight, walking the perimeter of the room. He traced the faint smudge near the counter where the bottle had been placed, as though someone had moved it quickly with wet fingers. He looked again at the untouched wine glass, the rim clean, no trace of John's usual fingerprints. It wasn't enough to accuse Marissa, but enough to keep the investigation alive in his mind. She was clever, he admitted to himself. Clever enough to fool the casual eye. But cleverness always left seams if you knew where to look. Outside the window, rain threatened again, tapping faintly against the glass. In that sound, Alvarez felt the stirrings of something deeper, a case that would not allow itself to be buried quietly. Mark, too, wasn't ready to let go. He sat awake in his apartment, staring at old photos of him and John, his jaw tight with determination. If the police didn't press harder, he would. The silence after John's death was beginning to fracture. Whispers of doubt were growing louder, and soon they would no longer be whispers. The shadows were gathering, and Alvarez knew one thing for certain. This was no accident. It was the beginning of a hunt. Kyle had always been the weak link. Marissa knew it from the start, but she believed she could control him, mold him, keep him quiet with promises of a glittering future. Yet, in the weeks following John's death, Kyle's arrogance began to swell as quickly as Marissa's dread. It started one night, in a smoky bar on the edge of town. Kyle nursed a glass of whiskey with an old acquaintance he hadn't seen in years. The liquor loosened his tongue, and with it came the reckless pride of a man who thought he had finally won. He leaned across the sticky wooden table and whispered, almost giddy, "You wouldn't believe what I've got coming my way. Let's just say, money isn't going to be a problem anymore. Not for me. Not for her." His companion raised an eyebrow. "Her," Kyle smirked, tapping the rim of his glass. "A lady with a tragic loss. You'll see soon enough. She's about to be very wealthy, and I'll be right there beside her." The friend didn't press further, but in a small town, whispers were currency. By morning, those whispers had traveled, bending and reshaping with every retelling until they landed where Kyle never expected, on Detective Alvarez's desk. Alvarez had already been circling the case like a hawk. Marissa's grief struck him as too polished, too deliberate, as though she had studied the performance of a widow rather than lived it. The untouched wine glass, the conveniently misplaced bottle, the faint traces of crushed powder in the sink. These weren't just oversights, they were breadcrumbs. And now, the rumor of a man boasting about a sudden inheritance felt like the trail's next step. He tracked the story back, patient and methodical, until Kyle's name surfaced. The first connection was circumstantial, an acquaintance recalling Kyle's drunken ramble. But Alvarez was relentless. He checked phone records, financial transactions, and surveillance footage. Soon enough, the picture began to form. Late-night calls between Kyle and Marissa, Text messages filled with careful wording, but too frequent to dismiss as casual. Meanwhile, Mark, John's best friend, had not stopped pressing the police. He haunted Alvarez's office, bringing in his own suspicions and gut instincts. When Alvarez finally mentioned Kyle's name, Mark's reaction was visceral. "I knew it," he spat. "John always thought there was something off about that guy. Too smug, too eager to hang around when he wasn't wanted. And Marissa, she laughed at his jokes a little too easily." Together, their suspicions coalesced into something tangible. Alvarez ordered discreet surveillance on both Marissa and Kyle, careful not to spook them. It didn't take long for cracks to show. Kyle, emboldened by his belief that the investigation was over, began spending more freely, flashing cash that didn't align with his modest job. A new watch here, a whispered deposit there. Each action chipped away at the illusion Marissa had so carefully built. Marissa noticed his recklessness too. She cornered him one evening in her living room, the very room where John had taken his final breaths. "You need to shut your mouth," she hissed, eyes sharp as glass. "Every word you say puts us both in danger. Do you understand that?" Kyle shrugged, the whiskey on his breath thick. "Relax, baby. They bought your performance. Nobody suspects a thing. We're free." But even as he said it, he didn't believe it. Marissa saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes, the paranoia beginning to creep in. She felt it too. The walls were closing in, and Kyle's carelessness was tightening the noose around their necks. Detective Alvarez, watching from the shadows, didn't yet have proof, but he had momentum. And momentum was often all it took to topple a carefully staged lie. The night Kyle bragged again, louder and bolder than before, Alvarez knew it was only a matter of time before the mask Marissa wore would finally crack. And when it did, the secrets they thought buried would come rushing to the surface. The walls of Marissa's house, once a sanctuary of her carefully constructed lies, now seemed to press inward with suffocating weight. Each knock at the door, each ring of the phone, rattled her nerves. Detective Alvarez's questions lingered in her head, and Mark's cold, distrustful stares haunted her every waking thought. Yet the greatest threat wasn't outside her home. It was inside her circle. Kyle. That night, when the air was heavy with late summer humidity, Kyle appeared unannounced. He slipped in through the back door, the one John had always left unlocked. His eyes were wild, his hands restless, as though his own guilt had taken form and gnawed at him. "You're slipping, Marissa," Kyle hissed, his voice low but edged with rage. "Alvarez is circling. Mark won't shut up. And you're walking around like nothing happened." Marissa's jaw tightened. She tried to steady her breathing, but inside, her chest burned with fear and fury. "Keep your voice down," she snapped, gesturing toward the thin walls. "Do you want the whole neighborhood to hear you?" But Kyle didn't lower his tone. Instead, he leaned closer, his breath sour with alcohol. "I want what I was promised. The money. The life you said we'd have once John was out of the picture. You've got it now, Marissa. Insurance, assets, everything. So when do I get my share?" She narrowed her eyes. "You'll get what I decide when I decide. Do you think I went through all of this just to hand you the keys to the kingdom? Don't be stupid." Kyle laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that seemed to rattle the air between them. "Don't you dare play me. I know too much. One word from me, and Alvarez will know exactly where to look. You wouldn't last a week." The threat sliced through her composure. For weeks, she had played the role of the grieving widow flawlessly, crying on cue, rehearsing her story, even manipulating sympathy from those who once doubted her. But now, under the weight of Kyle's betrayal, the cracks began to widen. Her hands trembled as she pointed a finger at him. "Don't you ever threaten me, Kyle. You were reckless enough already, running your mouth to your friends, bragging about money that isn't yours. Do you think Alvarez won't notice? He's not stupid. He already suspects." Kyle smirked, but there was no confidence in it. His eyes flickered nervously, darting toward the window where the curtains shifted with a faint breeze. "Then maybe I should get ahead of it," he said coldly. "Maybe I should tell him everything before it all comes down on me. Better me than both of us." The silence that followed was electric, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Marissa's heart thundered in her chest. The mask she had worn for so long finally faltered. Her voice, when it came, was raw and sharp. "If you ruin this for me, I swear, Kyle, you'll regret it." Their argument spiraled, voices rising, accusations flung like daggers. Neither noticed how loud they had become. Neither saw the lights flick on in the house next door, or the shadows that paused by open windows. Mrs. Callahan, their elderly neighbor, leaned on her porch rail and frowned. She had seen too much, heard too much, voices carried in the stillness of night. She didn't know the details, but she knew the tone of desperation when she heard it, and she knew trouble was brewing. Inside, Marissa's hands clenched into fists, her breathing ragged. Kyle's threats hung in the air, poisoning what little trust had once bound them. The fragile alliance had shattered, and as the argument ended with Kyle storming out, slamming the back door so hard it shook the frame, Marissa realized the walls of silence that had once protected her were crumbling. Someone had heard. Someone always hears. The night swallowed the house in darkness again, but Marissa's secret was no longer confined within its walls. Detective Alvarez knew the case was close to breaking. For weeks, he had followed every lead, pushed through every lie, and waited patiently for Marissa or Kyle to make a mistake that would tighten the noose around them. That mistake came in the form of a cell phone. Kyle, sloppy and nervous after his late-night shouting match with Marissa, hadn't been careful. His text history was full of incriminating messages, cryptic enough to raise questions, damning enough to connect him to her plot. Lines like, "He won't be a problem much longer," and "After this, we're set for life," were all the detective needed to drag both of them deeper into the spotlight. Still, texts weren't enough. Alvarez needed something stronger, something that would hold up in court. That proof came when Kyle, cornered by his own paranoia, cracked under pressure, brought in for questioning. He tried to play it cool at first, but his bravado dissolved quickly. In the dim interrogation room, with nothing but a tape recorder and Alvarez's steady gaze, Kyle began to sweat. He asked for water, then for a cigarette, then finally blurted out, "It wasn't supposed to go that far." His words poured out like acid, searing every illusion Marissa had built. He admitted to the affair. He admitted to knowing about John's medication. And though he tried to paint himself as a reluctant accomplice, his confession tied Marissa directly to the murder. Armed with Kyle's statement, the toxicology reports, and the carefully preserved pill bottles found hidden in Marissa's vanity drawer, Alvarez finally had the case he needed. The arrest was swift. Officers arrived at Marissa's home one gray morning, the air damp with rain. She didn't fight, didn't scream. She simply looked at the officers with a detached calm, as if she had been expecting them all along. "Do what you have to," she said coldly, slipping her wrists into the cuffs without a word of protest. The trial became a spectacle. Reporters filled the courthouse steps, their cameras flashing as Marissa was led in each morning, impeccably dressed but stone-faced. Inside, the jury listened to the evidence, Kyle's trembling testimony, the digital trail of text messages, the expert witnesses confirming John's death had not been an accident. But what struck the jurors most wasn't the evidence. It was Marissa herself. Her demeanor was chilling. While others wept, while John's friends testified about his kindness and his family spoke of their loss, Marissa sat still, unflinching, as if she were merely a spectator at her own trial. When she did speak, her words dripped with arrogance. She denied the affair, denied the plan, denied even caring about the money. Yet her voice carried no grief for her husband, no flicker of sorrow for the life she had destroyed. The jury didn't deliberate long. They returned with a guilty verdict, and the judge, his face stern and unyielding, handed down a lengthy sentence. Marissa barely reacted. No tears, no pleas, just the same cold mask she had worn since her arrest. But justice, as Alvarez knew too well, rarely came clean. The lottery winnings that had sparked this chain of greed and betrayal vanished in a storm of legal fees, restitution payments, and court-ordered compensations. What little remained was consumed by bureaucratic clause. There was no happy ending, no fortune left to sweeten the bitterness. Kyle, in exchange for his cooperation, received a lighter sentence, but found himself branded forever, a traitor, a liar, and an accomplice to murder. As for John, the man at the center of it all, His memory became both the tragedy and the warning. His death left a void that no verdict could ever fill. His best friend Mark, who had pushed so hard for the truth, walked out of the courthouse with a hollow victory. "Everyone lost," he muttered to Alvarez on the courthouse steps. The detective could only nod. The cameras faded, the crowd dispersed, and the world moved on, as it always does. But in the shadows of that courthouse, a sobering truth lingered. Justice had been served, yes, but at a price that left scars no one could ever erase. And for those who had played their parts in this twisted tale of love, betrayal, and greed, the story was far from over. The trial ended, the cameras left, and the courthouse steps that once buzzed with reporters fell silent. Marissa was led away in shackles, her eyes forward, face frozen in that same cold mask she had worn throughout the trial. For many, it was the final image they would ever have of her, a woman who had everything and gambled it all for something more. But the end of her story did not mean peace for those she left behind. Daniel, gaunt from stress and grief, found himself sitting alone at the kitchen table most nights. The house felt cavernous, haunted not by ghosts, but by the heavy silence of betrayal. His wife had not only broken their vows, she had poisoned the very air of his life. And though she was gone, the weight remained. He stopped playing the old jazz records they once danced to. He stopped dreaming about trips they had promised each other. Now he simply endured. Kyle, the reckless lover who thought fortune had finally favored him, became a shadow of himself. His testimony against Marissa spared him from prison, but it branded him a coward, a traitor, and a fool. Friends abandoned him. Work dried up. He was left with nothing but the bitter knowledge that the woman he had desired never truly cared for him, only for what he represented in her elaborate escape plan. On quiet nights, he replayed their arguments in his head, hearing again the venom in her voice. He knew he had been used, and worse, that he had helped destroy everything. Detective Alvarez, though hailed for his persistence, felt little satisfaction. Justice, yes, had been served on paper. Marissa was sentenced, the evidence undeniable. But Alvarez had walked these halls of ruin before, and he knew better than most. Justice never truly fixed what was broken. It only offered a rough boundary, a line drawn in the sand against the chaos people could unleash upon each other. For Daniel, for Kyle, even for the neighborhood that once admired Marissa's charm, there were no real winners, only survivors. The lottery money that had once seemed like a golden ticket evaporated. Legal fees, restitution, debts, all swallowed the millions in a matter of months. The dream that had sparked envy, lust, and destruction left nothing but empty bank accounts and fractured lives. In the end, the money lasted about as long as Marissa's lies, and so the story faded from headlines, replaced by newer scandals, fresher tragedies. Neighbors stopped whispering. Reporters moved on. The world kept spinning, indifferent as always. But for those closest to it, the echoes remained. Daniel could never quite shake the memory of her smile, the way she once touched his hand at dinner as though she meant forever. Kyle could never outrun the shame of his choices. And Alvarez carried yet another case file closed, but not truly finished, because in the quiet of the night, he sometimes wondered if Marissa had simply been a mirror, showing how greed, desire, and desperation could twist anyone, given the right chance. The ashes of fortune settled, leaving behind only scars. In the end, the greatest tragedy wasn't Marissa's fall, or Daniel's broken heart, or even Kyle's humiliation. It was the simple, brutal truth. When greed enters love, there are no winners, only ruins where something once beautiful used to be.